So, Tim Wu, recently candidate for Lieutenant Governor of the great state of New York. Previously and still a professor of law at Columbia University Law School. The coiner of the phrase network neutrality. The author of a really good book called oh, now I'm going to blow it. The Master Switch, that's it. I knew it. I knew it had a switch in it. Okay. The Master Switch, which outlines the capture of each medium up until the internet, and then Tim Wu.
Thank you. David, thanks. Thank you so much for helping turn my note here. It's on. Is it on? It's on. No, it's just me being loud. There we go. Now it's actually on. So thank you. Whoa, there you go. All right. You're not on unless there's feedback. So. All right, here we go. Like a concert. So thank you, David, for where'd you go? For inviting me. Thank you. You know, yeah, the actual antecedents. There's many antecedents to net neutrality, but you would be foolish not to mention David's paper, the rise of the stupid network. Did I get the name right? 1997, which basically, and I want to put a round. I mean, there's a lot. No one really invents anything new. There's nothing new under the sun. But the rise of the stupid network really had a lot of the ideas that just became law this last week. So I want a round of applause for David, our organizer. The other thing I want to mention is that I am hosting a happy hour, after party sort of thing, right after the conference at that bar right there down the street. Obviously, attendance not mandatory, but it's. Here we are. I guess you can figure this out, right? 17th Street, Rye House. It's a good place. They have a lot of different types of rye and other whiskeys. And it's pretty spacious. So join me, and I think we can hang out and talk more about these things. The topic of my presentation today, if we have it, is how the net neutrality argument was won. And I want to focus today on a very particular question. I'm not going to talk about what I would describe as the ground war, i.e., the organizing, the politics, the coalitions. That stuff is actually incredibly important, but I'm just not going to talk about it. I'm talking today only about the messaging. Because I've been thinking about the last 13 years. In some ways, I think net neutrality will become a case study for people who want to achieve things in tech policy. What is the best way to do it? And I've been thinking over the last 13 years about some of the things that were successful in the messaging, in the argumentation, as opposed to the tactics that were important. And I've boiled them down to 5 things that I think were really important, and that's what I'm going to present on the next 15, 20 minutes today. So this is like the air war side. And we'll just begin. So the first thing I think, can you go back to? The first important point I think, and one of the reasons I think net neutrality was successful in becoming a movement, is because it put the principles first. It worked harder on trying to get people to believe in the norms and underlying principles than in any particular law or technical standard. And so, for example, if you look, there was a lot of good work done that linked the principles of net neutrality and internet openness to a lot of very powerful concepts with a long history in America, or a lot of importance to people. On short list, there's more than this. It was like non-discrimination rules. It had links to free speech, freedom to tinker, openness, you name it, fair competition, antitrust principles, decentralization. It did that as opposed to trying to lead, if you go to the next thing, with trying to focus on, we need a movement to reverse brand X, or let's start with a TCP/IP standard. All these things I think are important, actually. But they don't necessarily become principles for the ages. And I think it was always important that net neutrality movement focused on the underlying righteousness of the cause, and therefore when people got into it, they were sort of converted, whether or not they didn't have to believe that brand X was wrongly decided in order to be into net neutrality. You didn't have to believe that TCP/IP was a gift from God, even though it might have been. You know, you didn't have to, that one's a little closer, you didn't have to be like a believer in BGP routing protocol or something. You had to believe in freedom or you know, the idea of the internet was a frontier. There was something valuable here, and I think that was really important. And you can see that in some of the messaging. So I want to say a lot of people put a lot of work into linking these issues. To go back, oh no, go backwards, not forward. You know, I think about Larry Lessig very early on, Jonathan Zittrain, David. I'm probably going to miss people, Yochai Benkler. A lot of people, Susan Crawford, spent a lot of time trying to link these issues together. And I think that groundwork was really important for the ultimate success of the movement. So moving ahead, you can sort of see how it gets manifested. This is in 2006, you know, where some fan thing just, you know, all bits are created equal, so they're picking up on the equality idea. We go to the next one. So Al Franken at some point started picking up on the First Amendment idea that it's a platform for making speech possible, that net neutrality, and so that anchors it to obviously one of the oldest foundational values in the United States. This is not a complete list. The slow lane stuff, which started this year, I think most conspicuously, built on this concern, growing concerns about inequality, and I think played them very, very effectively. You know, the idea this is a public infrastructure, and the same way a sidewalk doesn't have like a fast lane or slow lane, there needs to be some parts of America that are still equal, and I think the slow lane was very successful in exploiting or getting closer to a deeper value. And I think maybe one more, I can't remember. Okay, so here's the second thing I think was really important and why the net neutrality movement argumentatively had some success. It was always styled as a movement to preserve or save something as opposed to take new action. In other words, the style of it was, there's this really great thing that was created, is working really well, and a bunch of people want to destroy it. You know, namely the cable and telephone companies, the broadband carriers, want to mess with it. Someone said once that most true revolutions are styled as counter-revolutions. The American Revolution, for example, was often styled as about the actual rights of Englishmen. You know, we're reestablishing, we've been denied our rights as Englishmen. And so there was this idea of trying to save something as opposed to, you know, we need to create an open internet, or we need to take action to build something. And I think that really worked. If you look at some of the messaging, it starts, this is, oh, well, this is the, so this is an old, I think this is from Free Press. Someone in this room probably did this. Tim probably did this. Tim picked up, a lot of people who did these actual campaigns were good. You know, it starts with this, I'm not sure, actually I wouldn't really mind if they were to blow up Congress, but that's a different issue. These invaders blocking net neutrality is under attack, later evolved to become something just to save the internet, which was seen everywhere. I think that's also Free Press, if I'm not mistaken. And that theme was picked up by lots of decentralized people. For example, you know, this particular book right here. There was a period it became I don't know if everyone remembers this. Next slide, slightly not G-rated. But does everyone remember this woman who started posing naked for net neutrality? Anyway, I guess you have to be, remember, that was from the 06 or so. And I think we have one more, I can't remember. Next one. And of course, this, which flew over Comcast, I think 2 weeks ago. Grumpy cat, don't mess with it. So all these are messaging which is about preserving something good as opposed to trying to build something that didn't exist. The third principle is that rhetorically and in its argumentation, the net neutrality movement, I think at its best, was always a reaction to things which were pretty clearly wrong, that most people could agree they didn't like, and tended to rely on thou shalt not rules, which I think since biblical times have been more successful forms of laws than thou shalt. They're easier to enforce. You know, here's a list of things you shouldn't do based on things we've seen. Kind of the common law method to lawmaking. And so if you go back to 2002, right at the beginning, one of the issues, this is something in the first net neutrality paper I worked on or wrote. I got interested in AT&T's DSL service, conditions of use. And they say, these are the things you're not allowed to use on your computer. Mail, FTP, HTTP, file sharing, game news rooks, proxy, IRC services, multi-user interactive forums, and Wi-Fi devices. So I was like, who thinks that banning Wi-Fi is a good idea? I mean, how can that? So it was kind of built on these examples. Like, no one sits there and says, oh, yeah, that's a great thing to ban Wi-Fi. And I think it was really important in the movement that it was concrete like that it wasn't you know, just, oh, this is this good thing, the internet's great. But sometimes you'd be like, they want to do these things, and here's the examples. The next example, which I think built the movement very powerfully, is this one, which was in 2005, I think. This is when you had the first instances of actual blocking of voice over IP. And when that happened, it was like, this is not some kind of joke. This is, they obviously, left their druthers, the phone companies are going to block VoIP. Why wouldn't they? They block Vonage. And you know, the cable companies are going to block, there wasn't YouTube, maybe there was, no, there wasn't YouTube yet. They're going to block internet video. What would have been internet video in 2003?
Broadcast.com.
Broadcast.com. There's a company called Pi. Does anyone remember them? Shockwave. So they're going to block those guys because they, and you know, and so it's built on these ideas like no blocking. The basic, I think, success was not, oh, vaguely we need to preserve an open internet, but here are the thou shalt nots. Thou shalt not block, thou shalt not degrade, thou shalt not put stuff into a slow lane, and thou shalt be transparent. So there is one shall, but at least transparency, which is a little easier to enforce. And I think that was very important. The next principles was having, there was one thing that I think gave the movement some success, was a willingness to sort of just try out various slogans and labels and see what stuck and see what didn't. One of the problems I think the cable and phone companies had, as I'll talk about later, is I think they got their talking points set up in 2002 and stuck with them for 12 years. And so like here in 2015, I'm still hearing the same talking point I heard in 15 years ago, and actually things have changed. And so there were a lot of words, if you look at the next slide, that had to do with this concept. I mean, everyone kind of who is a serious internet person has an underlying feeling for what this is about. And I think one of the successful things was just to try out a lot of different words and see what kind of stuck and see what kind of worked with people. And you know, all these words kind of come up now and then. Ultimately, sort of convalesced on net neutrality, but it wasn't because someone said, okay, this is the rule, or this is the slogan, and this is, you know, what we're going to call it. It's because people just started saying it because they thought it was something real, as opposed to some, you know, word we'd come up with one day. I think that's really important when you think about the future, is if you try too aggressively to name things and stick with the name, it can really backfire. You have to go with whatever happens to stick. And I'll say about net neutrality itself, the word, even though it has been, you know, the risk of sounding a little defensive, it has been maligned. Ariana Huffington, the first time I met her, she's like, what on earth it sounds like a tennis tournament or something, a terrible idea. So, you know, obviously it had its, you know, there's some downsides to it, but to the phrase. But it has several advantages too, which I'll point out. One of which it sounds like it's actually something official. You know, a little like Social Security. Without being too far. You know, when you name something that's a little bit when there's too much loaded into it, like network freedom or, you know, the Patriot Act, there's some percentage of people are like, give me a break. You know, they see the argument into it. So there's something very important about using terms that favor your side, but subtly, that don't like bang you over the head with it. Because if you bang it over the head, the press won't use it. The press is not going to use something like, yes, the network freedom rule, because they're like, oh, come on, right? But it sounds, and I think that's a really subtle, important thing, to use phrases which capture something accurate but are in some ways slightly serve the interest. And once The carriers had to start using the phrase net neutrality. Well, then they have to start saying we're against net neutrality, and who wants to say that they're against it? It doesn't sound very attractive to be on that side. I mean, they didn't stop them sometimes. And often the carriers would have to say, yes, we believe in no blocking. We believe in no degradation. We believe in basic net neutrality. It's just this Title II stuff or something. And then everyone's like, what's going on? You know, they got trapped in this. Which leads me to my final point, is there was a failure on the side of the carriers and telephone companies, I think, to come up with a competing vision that was alluring and seemed attractive. If you go to the next one, you know, if you look at this ad, this is kind of what people thought. I don't know if you can see this, but here they are, like, sort of snipping everything, and they're saying we're going to be better off. There was, you go to the next slide. You know, these are some of the arguments that were relied on by the broadband carriers against net neutrality. They sort of said, well, we need smart pipes. Sometimes they'd say sometimes they'd fall into the trap of using overly technical language and say QoS is really important. Christopher Yu tried this theory of network differentiation. We don't need net neutrality, we need net differentiation, which borrowed from economics. For a while, there was a solution looking for a problem. The problem is, I mean, this sort of sounds like basic politics, but all these were sort of negative. They never had a, like, here is what we envision. They just say some, you know, we're inventing the future sort of boilerplate stuff, but they didn't say, like, other than telemedicine. But I was always like, who's going to be operating over the public internet? It sounds like a crazy idea. You know, that was always like, well, if you have net neutrality, we won't have telemedicine. I was like, what exactly? Is that when you know, email your doctor? Like, what? How is it? How does it get in the way? Anyway, so I think a lot of that stuff would be done on private networks. So, but these were the, and I even, like, last week I heard solution looking for a problem. And one reason I think that cable and telecom, I mean, there's a lot of reasons they despite their resources, is they stuck to these tucking points like 15 years. They never changed. And I think actually the incentives to deploy argument was a stronger argument in 2000, you know, when they were building up the networks. And yes, they are still spending money on stuff, but you know, it's not as strong an argument 13 years later that we still need all the possible incentives possible, you know, even making money on slow lanes in order to, you know, to deploy. And so I think that was a serious problem. And if you just, this is just in closing. So the Washington Post ran an article on this exactly. The last message, I guess, was this is Obamacare for the internet. And it's worth noticing, if you look at this very last slide, that as they noticed for the first time, net neutrality actually became more searched for than Obamacare, so that didn't work either. Now, there's a risk of sort of self-congratulation here. I mean, one, I think, maybe final factor, if you go to the very last slide of mine, is Comcast, Verizon, AT&T are just not really sympathetic, likable companies. And that never really helped their cause, is that everyone had an experience where they were like, fuck that company. You know? So everyone had that, and you know, that kind of gave every argument a little bit of extra juice. Anyway, thank you very much. And I'd be pleased if you want to stop the questions over here again. I'm also curious if anyone else thinks there's anything I missed, because there's a lot of people in the audience who did a lot of the work on these things.
Yeah, hang on.
ObamaNet. Well, we could try that one. Well, John Oliver made a huge difference, obviously. But I'm sort of trying to talk just about the words and not about like organizing and the